Hello, everybody. Welcome to Raising Multilinguals Live. My name is Tetsu Young from Ask Tetsu. Can you believe it? It's snowing here outside of my house right now, right near Montreal. So if you're in the area, you know it's pretty cold. Okay.
And hello, everyone from wherever you are connecting today. My name is Ute Limacher-Riebold from Ute's International Lounge. And today we are very honored to have Professor Dr. Ulrike Jessner as our guest, who will be talking about multilingual awareness as a cognitive benefit. Please allow me to introduce you very briefly before we dive in. So Ulrike Jessner is professor at the University in Innsbruck, Austria, and the University of Pannonia, Veszprem in Hungary, where she acts as founding member of the International Doctoral School of Multilingualism. She has published widely in the field of multilingualism with a special focus on the acquisition of English in multilingual contexts. She is the co-author of a Dynamic Model of Multilingualism with Philip Herdina in 2002, which pioneered complex dynamic system theory in language acquisition research. She has been engaged in the development of the research area of third language acquisition and multilingualism as a founder, member, and president of the International Association of Multilingualism. She is also founding editor of the International Journal of Multilingualism and the book series Trends in Applied Linguistics. With her work on metalinguistic awareness and multilingual learning, she opened a new research avenue on metacognition in multilingual learning and teaching. And currently she is carrying out a longitudinal study in the Ladin trilingual kindergarten and primary schools in South Tyrol, Italy. Thank you very much for being our guest today, Ulrike. And
I'm happy. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you.
We are very honored to have you, and especially because we're going to focus on multilinguals and an approach that embraces all the languages and not only one or two or a few. So please, first of all, could you please tell us about yourself, your involvement in the world of languages, and in particular, multilingual learning and cognition through linguistic giftedness and others?
Yeah, I was trained as a language teacher of English and French. Which actually sparked my interest in multilingualism and the acquisition of multiple languages. So from the beginning of my university studies, I actually have always been interested in the links between the languages, my own languages, including Latin and varieties of German. So I do not come from this exciting multilingual background myself. So I grew up with a variety of German mainly at the beginning of my life, but then got more and more interested in the learning of languages. For my doctoral thesis, I focused on gender and first language acquisition. And then worked on second language acquisition, third language acquisition, before actually, you mentioned it already, my colleague Philip Herdina introduced me to his ideas on the application of dynamic system theory or complexity theory to language acquisition in general and multilingualism in particular. And then based on that interest in the learning processes of students, actually in our department, those students that come from South Tyrol, that is, come from a totally different context, and who actually then learn English in our department. And in my habilitation, I worked on their metalinguistic awareness, and I actually chose students from bilingual families, assuming that the level of awareness would be pretty high, and then had a look at their production of English as a target language. And so already at the time, I focused on metalinguistic awareness, which had been already identified, of course, in the 60s in the classical study of Bill and Lambert. So I won't go into that now, but also Vygotsky pointed out. And that was early work in the 50s, and it was translated in the 60s. So the English version came out in the 60s. And he already pointed to this increased level of metalinguistic awareness once you get in contact with another language, and that could also be a foreign language. So I for my studies, actually, and I traveled to the US, worked with Elizabeth Bates, who is very early. She promoted a dynamic view, although not many people were aware of that. And then I spent time with Jim Cummins in Canada, and some time with François Grosjean in Switzerland.
Wow.
So that was very exciting. And then I published the 2006 book on linguistic awareness. So in giftedness, because you asked for it, in multilingual learning is actually related to language experience, aptitude, as explained in the dynamic model. And verbal giftedness in learning in general depends on other factors, of course, as well. But we'll go into that, I assume, when we go along.
Yes, exactly. And maybe we can, there are many terms, and I know that many of our followers are very familiar with many of them, but maybe it's good if we tackle some of them today.
Of course.
So maybe we can focus on what the cognitive advantages actually are of multilingual learning. I mean, we know some of them, but what are the cognitive advantages of multilingual learning and metalinguistic awareness? You mentioned both before shortly. Can you maybe expand on that, please?
Okay.
Well, perhaps maybe we want to make sure that people understand metalinguistic awareness.
Yes.
What that would actually
mean.
mean.
I can start with that if you want that. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So metalinguistic awareness refers to meta-knowledge concerning language in very general terms. In most cases, what is meant is grammatical knowledge and knowledge about parts of speech. So if somebody is able to name parts of speech, what is the subject in this sentence, that would be meta-knowledge, metalinguistic knowledge, which forms part of the curriculum and language learning most of the time. And in my 2006 book, I explored that knowledge and actually found that in multilinguals, it needs more than just this focus on the parts of the speech or grammatical knowledge. It's also necessary to look at at comparisons between languages, the differences and similarities between languages, because that forms part of what I later termed multilingual awareness as well. So, by now we have significant evidence from many studies, particularly from studies on third language acquisition, that have found that there are linguistic and cognitive advantages in bilinguals that learn a third language. And there were studies on, learning English as a third that were first carried out in the Basque Country, where they learn English as a third, but grow up with Basque and Spanish, or only Basque, and then as Spanish is added later on, etc.
No, I was going to say, why from the third language and not at the second or fourth, or why specifically would this be so significant at the third language per se?
Because you already you already have built up a meta system, because you already compared two, and then when you move along and then encounter a third one, you've already you can turn to this meta system in order to find out about differences and similarities. And in third language acquisition research, by now we've identified a number of factors that, for instance, that, and I always get the question that in third language acquisition, sometimes people who learn a third language, they are surprised about their own verbal behavior because, for instance, they turn to the foreign language that they learn and not the dominant one. So in third language acquisition, that it's called the foreign language effect. So that, or the L2 status, sometimes it can be a mixture of both. So you turn to the most recently learned language, that if that was a foreign one. And then I just heard it from a student of mine just before the last session before Easter, and he said, "Yeah, I'm learning Japanese, and I always go to French, and I don't understand why. Why is this?" Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's highly interesting, especially talking to or about multilinguals and maybe children who grew up with two languages first that they acquire more or less naturally, and then maybe are schooled in another language, and then you add the fourth, fifth language, and maybe children are a little, depending on their age, are less aware of what comparison, how they link these languages together. But with your studies, I find it very interesting to see what you just mentioned, that sometimes you refer to a recently learned or acquired language instead of the firstest one. I know it's not right, but so I'm doing now a child speech. Someone, yes.
The firstest is the bestest. Right?
It's the bestest. No, it's not. But
it depends. It depends. So it's complex. Yes. It's complex, but you have to move beyond the comparison of two in order to understand that third language acquisition can work totally differently, and it's also important to see that it's not always the dominant language that it exerts the influence on the third one. And that's why it's important to move beyond the study of two.
So if I may, I guess I'm not sure if I understood you correctly. Did your studies show that the third language was most significant for the person to realize? I guess the
awareness.
Yeah, the awareness per se. Or was the study itself structured as a third language learning? Because I believe you talked about third language studies in and of itself a type of a field, I guess, of studies. So were you going in with the third language already in your investigations? Or did the third language awareness, I guess, did it come out as a result of your studies? That's where I'm not fully clear.
Okay. I mean, there have been a number of studies over the last 20 years when we started working in this field that now has established itself as a field on its own as well. Because we're interested in working on the similarities and differences between second language acquisition and third language acquisition, and of course you can move further in the language acquisition process. So it depends on the methodology that is used in the study, on where you put the focus. Of course, it could be that you study third language acquisition right from the beginning, so that you have a look at how people decode, for instance, a third language. a totally new language system, totally unknown to the participants, and then you have a look whether they can build on the metalinguistic awareness that they've developed so far. Or you can have a look at metalinguistic tasks in the process of learning the third. So it really depends on how you do that. There are all sorts of methodology.
And I sort of feel a lot of this would definitely depend on the pair of the first two languages. If you have something, two languages are very close together, French and Spanish or something, then, and the third one is Japanese, and suddenly you have a big difference. But if you have already English and Japanese, and then you learn Spanish, I don't know. I guess that the metalinguistic awareness would be different for the participant, depending on the first two languages.
So typology, this is what you introduce as a topic here. Of course, it's very important. So are the languages typologically related? Are they not related? But then we also have something that was actually discovered quite a number of years before we started working on third language acquisition, and that is psychotypology, so that also the learner can come up with his own typology because he sees relatedness to whatever, and then works with that. And there's a lot to be said about that, because it's a complex phenomenon. Indeed. Also, that sometimes people have the feeling that languages appear to be too close. So that you then doubt yourself when you go for a certain version, because you think that can't be true, because that must be wrong, because it's so much alike the other language. So I'm sure you know about that.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. And I think I would like to go back slowly to also the next question that we have. And I think what you also mentioned is language proficiency of multilinguals. That is actually not, and I quote here from a chapter in Larissa Aronin's book that is going to come out soon, Advanced Guide to Multilingualism, so that language proficiency of multilinguals is not simply the sum of their skills in several languages they have mastered and are mastering. And you see multilingual proficiency in a different way. So we can maybe dive into this in a moment. But you have actually developed the dynamic model of multilingualism. And I think it's time maybe to dive into this. Can you maybe explain how this dynamic model of multilingualism works?
Yeah. As I already explained before, but very shortly, the dynamic model of multilingualism is the first book monograph that actually applied. At the time, it was called dynamic system theory. That's what we called it in a book. But this is related to complexity theory that you've heard much more about actually during the pandemics. At least in Austria, that was the case, because people tried to model development of the virus in society. But behind all of that, complexity theory is a theory that you can apply to complex systems. And so why is it a theory that comes in handy, so to speak, to be applied to multilingualism? Because we're dealing with a dynamic phenomenon, because we have to focus on change. And this is what's being done in complexity theory. And only when we have a look at a change in development, we'll be able to understand phenomena in their development. Because before dynamic system theory was introduced to language learning, most people were actually working with static, the understanding of development. I mean, not even thinking about development as such, but about, certain phases in development, and they were all understood as being static, that they wouldn't change, and also dealing with systems as being unrelated, so that languages would not be in contact. They wouldn't interact with each other. We actually focus on the change in development, on the interrelatedness between systems, on the interdependence between systems, and also on the complexity, so that it's also important to have a look at a holistic understanding of all the factors that are involved and their interaction. And beyond all of that, we try to have a look at other levels of awareness in research, so to speak, as I wrote it down not that long ago, because we need to link the linguistic to the cognitive level. And that's what we've already started talking about. And top of that, link the cognitive to the linguistic, vice versa, but also to the societal level, because context, of course, in multilingualism research play a big role. Yes. So we have all sorts of levels that need to be interrelated to get a picture of, or a bit insight into certain phenomena that develop in a person.
Yes. And I find this very, very important for parents also to understand, or for those who work with children who are exposed to multiple languages, because very often people, well, less and less have the impression that the languages are like stored in different parts of the brain. We know that's not true, but that they are constantly in interrelation with each other. They are at least those that are most dominant, so that we use more often on a daily basis, or on a regular basis, are more in the foreground, and so they tend to be merged, mixed, whatever term we want to use. But what I find also that you add with this dynamic model and with these different perspectives are the other perspectives that we sometimes forget. We think about the language as a grammar, is how you use the words, how you put them in an order that another person can understand them. But there are so many other factors that come into it, that play into this whole dynamic. And seeing it as not a constant and almost flat model, it gives him more facets and more depth, adding also the different languages to it all. I think like a mobile, I don't know how it's called now in English, where you have all the different things that are constantly moving. They are interrelated because they are in the head of our children or of the multilingual brain, but they are always there somewhere, and sometimes in the foreground, sometimes in the background, and that makes up this dynamics that you are describing in your research and that you are observing in the people that you analyze in your research. So I can imagine that someone who has maybe is 11 or 12 or even older and has 5 or more languages in their repertoire, it becomes very, very complex.
Of course. But what's also important, and that's why it's, we call this the dynamic modeling, also becomes important to what I pointed out before, from a long-term perspective, that it's totally normal that in a multilingual person or in multilingual development, attrition plays a role. Which otherwise, I mean, that was handled as two totally different phenomena. You had acquisition on the one hand and attrition on the other, whereas from a developmental perspective and from a multilingual perspective, the two phenomena form part of normal development, particularly when you change the environment, when a person changes the environment, like what you find in migrant children. It might mean that if they move to another context, that they think they forget part of the language that they heard before. I mean, I'm very careful about saying they forget, because I'm sure that knowledge gets reactivated very quickly.
Yes, and that, for example, a language that before was very dominant can become less dominant, but it can re-emerge again. So it's never really neither forgotten, like you now mentioned, nor lost. Yeah, we have also the language loss, and very often when these mechanisms are described, and where we parents sometimes get scared because we say, oh my gosh, my child is not responding in the language now for 4 months. Is my child going to forget or to lose the language? And understanding the dynamics of language acquisition and language development as being multi-dynamic makes, I think, a huge difference, because then first of all you can take a step back and also trust a little bit the process of the development, right? So if the language is needed at any further stage, it will come in the foreground again. It can be there because if you have the skills, some kind of the skills, you can foster them and go from there. So that is, I think, also some of the messages that I wanted to highlight today with this interview, that I find very eye-opening for many, because the approach that I see in other studies is very bidimensional, and either you do this or this and this happens, or you have lost, or you can forget it, and this is not the case. So the message is rather positivistic, more that I wanted to say. Great. I just would like to ask those who are following us live, please don't hesitate to ask your questions in the chat, and we'll be very happy to share them with Ulrike Jessner. Maybe we can go over to the next question that we had, and that is about linguistic verbal giftedness. I know it's another topic that you have highlighted. I know that Tetsu has many questions about that. How can this, first of all, what is verbal giftedness and how can it be recognized, and what role does then also code switching and code mixing and working memory play in this? We have now several topics in one question. I'm very much aware of that, so please feel free to pick whatever you prefer first, and then we go from there.
Yeah, I mean, when I read that question first, I was sure you had read that article that I published that was based on work of my PhD students on working memory and its role in verbal giftedness or linguistic giftedness. And to get started, the most significant characteristics of exceptionally successful learners is unusual verbal memory. So we have this focus in the definition of giftedness, even without putting the focus on linguistic giftedness, that when we try to judge or assess giftedness, the focus is on verbal memory, very often linked to verbal fluency. And actually recent definitions consider giftedness as potentially trainable, which is important because for a long time people were convinced that giftedness is something inherent and it's genetic, etc. We talk about that in a dynamic model as well when we talk about aptitude and language aptitude, that we do not consider it as necessarily inherent, but as a trainable ability. And actually, I use the acronym MLA that we also use for metalinguistic awareness. I also introduced it as the acronym for multi-language aptitude, being aware of the fact that if you get more and more experienced in language learning, you get this higher level of metalinguistic awareness. And of course, I mean, when we look at polyglots, and I had the pleasure to work with Alexander Aguay as one of the most interesting people, and not just Alexander, but the PhD student of mine worked, actually carried out interviews with, also Richard Simcott,
Very
and
good
other
friend.
people that,
Yes.
they're the polyglot community.
Yeah.
So of course I was interested in the language maintenance, which also plays a big part in the development of multiple languages. So coming back to metalinguistic awareness, of course, is the essence of how they proceed in the language work, we can call it, how they move on. And Alexander actually came to a conference of mine, actually together with Ellen Bialystok, 3 years ago. And it was interesting that what he did, he had actually recorded his learning process of Finnish, which was a novel language to him, just for us to show this at the conference. And it was highly interesting because he was working with Finnish, and he showed the process that he went through from the first day. It was just a week that he used, and of course highly interesting how he was working on that language and what the outcome was. So and when I look at the process, of course, for me it's very important to see the initial conditions of the process, because that's very important when we deal with complexity theory. So what are the abilities that he started with? What's the knowledge that he had when he started learning Finnish, which might be very different from people who learn it as a first foreign language, for instance. So he could build on all of that. So that much about giftedness and trainability of giftedness. And we're actually working on a questionnaire that he put together at the moment, and with preparing a publication where he was interested in the question of genetics playing a role in polyglots. What I've seen so far, it doesn't look as if that is needed in order to develop successfully.
So this is still Professor Arguelles, right?
Yeah.
I remember seeing him at the Polyglot conference in Japan, and he talked about the title of his talk was From Start to Finish, but finish.
That's the one.
Yeah.
That's the one.
But
that's the one.
I mean, well, you have the perfect person, I guess, if you want to talk about giftedness in languages, because I mean, he's got his system, and his meta-linguistic bank of information is just insane. so definitely.
Yeah, but we can learn from that.
Absolutely.
Language acquisition studies, you can learn a lot from the very successful learners, of course, and then we can apply that knowledge to classroom teaching. So working on strategies, etc. There's a lot to be said about that. Yeah,
absolutely. I really like this other perspective on multilingualism now, coming from polyglots, from people who are constantly learning more languages and building up, and they have, you mentioned it's a linguistic bank. I like to think about it like a toolbox. You have more and more tools and more sophisticated tools that you can use to understand and to build the next one. So this approach coming from even more languages than, let's say, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, we are talking about Richard Simcott, who speaks how many? 50 languages?
More than like 50. That. Yeah, more than 50. But those people don't. You know that they don't count. They can't count the languages as we do. They count language families or etc. So it's difficult for them to tell how many they can speak.
Yeah, and that with regards to other kind of approaches that always come from the monolingual part. So I like this shift now, looking at it from the other side, and also looking at it, like you mentioned now, that they never talk about count the languages, but count maybe the language families or those who are parented. And we were talking about it recently, that sometimes even if you don't study the language, but you listen to it, you are exposed to it, and all of a sudden you understand how much you understand, even if you just by listening to it, because it sounds similar, there are words that you recognize, and then you put these pieces together like a puzzle almost, and you can figure out what the puzzle is representing. So you understand the meaning of what the person is saying without even having to study it. And this is highly interesting also for those who work in education, right? And who, if they know what other languages the child or the adult, I mean, education for adults as well, adult learners, what they have already in their repertoire, how they can use it in a way to access or to become proficient earlier, quicker, or in another way.
Absolutely, and that also what you just mentioned, because you mentioned adults. This is where the advantage, where adults are advantaged in comparison to children, because they can build on that repertoire. They can build with the help of their metalinguistic awareness, this higher level of metalinguistic awareness that they might have reached at a certain age. They can build the new knowledge into the old system, and that helps them, of course, sometimes to move much faster.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would like to quickly let's see what our followers are saying. So Yamila Magali says, very interesting, thanks for the session. And we have, thank you, Yamila, for your comment. And we have someone else we all know, Larissa Aronin, thank you for following us, who is saying, great perspective of trainability of giftedness. Exactly, the trainability, being able to train the giftedness.
Indeed, yeah. When I first saw this question, in my mind, giftedness, I just sort of had, gifted kids in mind. So now I really see that it's just not the same topic. So thanks for the clarification there. Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, when we now I have an echo now. Okay. Is it okay for you?
No problem. No problem.
Okay.
We hear you very clearly.
Yeah. So in the study that I carried out with my student, we were actually working with gifted children.
Okay.
So that's he's a teacher in that school. Gifted. They were assessed in terms of giftedness. So this is IQ of 130 and beyond that they have to reach in order to be called gifted, and that they are allowed to that school. But then we concentrated on the gifted who learned more languages than the others. And this is what we did in that study. And we concentrated on the relatedness between working memory and metalinguistic awareness. And it turned out that in the multilinguals, so that the children that are gifted and multilingual, both working memory and the level of metalinguistic awareness are a predictor. So they are closely related factors in the cognitive level. So that's what we were working on.
Yeah, I guess in a way you're already sort of answering the next question that I had, since we're talking about working memory, which in my mind is short-term memory, and normally when we talk about learning languages, I have intuitively I say you need more long-term memory, something that sticks, that's already there for long-term memory. So this was sort of against what I had understood intuitively. But if we really dig down into the underlying mechanisms, can you elaborate on that a little bit, on what exactly makes a working memory part more important than the long-term memory?
I mean, in the study we used the digit spans in the experiments. Then you have to repeat numbers,
Mhm.
basically, that was used. And you could call this short-term memory.
Mhm.
But we also have to be aware of the fact that the short-term memory is a capability that is trained. That in those children that have been dealing with more languages, it's already a trained skill. So then, of course, you can say then this is short-term memory, or perhaps this is already long-term memory in a way, because it's it's not just those digit spans that we test, but it's the way this has been trained before. Again, a dynamic perspective of what we were talking about. And then in the long run, of course, you train your memory, and there are several methods that that people working with memory, and you've got people in Las Vegas working on that, and it's all fascinating how you can do that. We have to see that even short-term memory, you have to see this as a trained ability in multilinguals already, because of all that that forms part of multilingual proficiency, or the multilingual mind. Does that make sense to you?
Indeed, indeed.
Good.
And I just got questions firing left and right in my mind, and
Go ahead.
if it's okay, I hope I'm not opening a can of worms here, but
When I can't have an answer, I don't have an answer.
okay. I sort of feel that all the discussion we had today is really on actively learning the languages. Now, I'm going to make a very clear distinction between learning and acquiring, as the Stephen Krashen school of thought. Does this clash in a way? I sort of feel here we're really actively thinking about the awareness of the language. The grammar is what I can think about, but what you can retrieve from other languages and apply to your learning to your target, the next target language. But the Krashen school is more just simply reading and lots of input, actively, just not thinking about the grammar or the mechanics of languages, but just reading and doing massive input and actively learning, acquiring what you are interested in. So maybe there's no clash. I don't know. Is there anything that's...
Can I say something?
Ute, you can sort of jump in here.
I'm waiting for Ute first.
Oh my gosh, I personally don't see a clash.
Okay.
Because if you acquire and you recognize some patterns, you don't have to necessarily be able to name them to understand them and to use them like our children do. Because why do our children manage to say long sentences without knowing what a subject and a verb and an adverb and an adjective are? So they can do it before even having this metalinguistic skill set. Let me call it that way. I know it's not the right term for it, but they cannot name the label them, but they can still do it. So if you have an approach where you start from the grammar, and I think what Ulrike Jessner was saying now was, yes, it's a grammatical kind of awareness, but not one where every time you think about the similarities and the differences, you think, oh, that's an adverb and that's an adjective and it's in that position and that is the morpheme for plural or for the first person in singular or plural. It's more intuitive or much quicker in the brain of the person. So I'm not sure that this awareness.
Okay, well, let me put it this way.
Happening.
I think I'm going to agree that there's no clash per se, but I think there's a difference in that linguistic awareness. By definition, you are aware of it. You're aware that, oh, this sounds like this thing in this language, or this is, it looks like this type of, even if you can't name the grammar, it sounds like this word, or I can anchor this thought to this part of this language and apply. So you're aware of what you're doing mechanically. Whereas the Krashen way is he says this is, you do massive input and you subconsciously learn or absorb. He specifically uses that word, I think, subconsciously. You don't know that you're developing language when you're doing this. So I guess that's a big difference. Not having to say that there's a clash. I guess there is no clash. So I'll agree. I agree.
And don't we all at some point, when we compare one language to the other, especially when we see similarities, don't we all make this metalinguistic thinking where you say, oh, look, that sounds like French. Tuck, you have already done something.
Yeah.
So I think it's not all that unconscious. And so, but I would like to hear what Ulrike Jessner can say about this.
Yeah, that's why I said you can go ahead. That's interesting. Just listening. First of all, I'm not happy with this distinction between acquisition and learning, because we have many instances when the two intertwine. Again, from a long-term perspective. And we don't work with dichotomies very much in complexity theory. So I always use either acquisition or learning, but I mix them because that might make sense sometimes, but it is from a certain age onward, children tend to, and you would be surprised how early that starts, they start comparing their languages. So, and we have evidence from illiterates who have developed metalinguistic awareness. We have that, so that exists. So there's inferencing that is going on, etc., about meanings, sounds, etc. That starts very early, and it starts intuitively. So where questions, what is fine with questions assumption here is that only, it's only fine if you work with two languages, and when you concentrate on the first foreign or the second language at the beginning, and then you allow a silent period, etc. Something, for instance, that's important that teacher would understand, that this is something necessary in natural learning. And when you think of our classrooms, when children are bombarded from the first second on, so to speak, when they sit in a language classroom first time, they have to produce from the very beginning, which is quite odd. So they're not allowed to just listen, and if a child doesn't talk, you have to send it to the psychologist or whatever. So because that happens also in migrant children, and it's not necessarily based on a traumatic experience that the child went through, but needs time to adjust him or herself to the new situation. So aggression is fine in talking about this, language path, immersion, etc. So that it's good just to listen, but you cannot wipe out your thoughts. And if they start quite early, that you want to compare your languages, and that's fine, but this is when metalinguistic awareness starts. And but he's been criticized quite a bit in terms of comprehensible input. What is this? I mean, and much more. So I'm not happy with all of what he came up with, but some of his ideas, why not? You always have to link it to the knowledge that you have yourself. And from my perspective, not everything that he came up with can still be applied to research. So we should be critical of some of it, and particularly this acquisition learning dichotomy that doesn't, the moment you start school, and then you learn you learn other. You get another toolbox, as you called it. That's fine. So acquisition doesn't This doesn't apply any longer.
Yeah, I think the way I understand it was more to have it on a continuum, on a diachronic continuum, so throughout time. So the acquisition in very early stage, and then it becomes learning. Yeah, but the distinction of natural learning, natural acquisition, or like the very young children do, and then the later the thinking about it and also the grammar, etc. That's then part of the learning. But we are digressing, I think, a little bit from the topic of today. So we were talking about this this other topic, that is the multilingual or metalinguistic awareness that multilinguals have, and that is actually also one of the advantages that we have, right, when we learn different languages across the lifespan, not only in very young age. And I find this aspect that you mentioned several times, the importance also to listen to and to observe and study adult persons, how they learn additional languages and more languages, and how they link them together, and that there is not a continuum. I have in mind, yes, the language development like very straight line. No, it's not. It's going up and down, and it turns around maybe sometimes, and leads us to where we are now. But I think this dynamic model that you developed, and that makes very, very much sense to me, is something that, in my opinion, it will help a lot of parents and also educators and teachers to understand a little bit more about what is going on in the little children and the students and the adults that they are teaching the languages about.
Coming back to Crash, and if I may add that, he was convinced of the non-interdependence. He came up with the non-interdependence hypothesis. So languages are not related. There's a lot to be said about that, and that's not what we know nowadays. So we have much more evidence that languages are related, and they are in constant exchange with each other. Even if we think they are dormant, they might pop up, as I explained when we started that interview. Yeah.
Yes, when you least expect them, right? They just pop up, and you say, "Oh, it's there again." Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, I do see that Ulrike is. It's getting dark in your area.
I can add some light. I've forgotten about that. That might be nicer.
Yes.
Better.
We have to shed some light on everything.
That's what we're trying to do all the time.
Absolutely. Yes.
Well, that was most interesting. I've learned quite a lot today. Clarified a lot of unknown vocabulary for myself. So thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
Definitely a shout out to everybody who's been watching us on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. Thank you for your time, sharing your time with us. Thank you for your comments, Yamila, Larissa, and Sarah. Sarah just put in a comment right now. So thank you for this informative session. As always, your web initiative makes this multilingual journey a lot less lonely, and a lot less lonely. That means so much to us because our mission is really to bring the cutting edge of knowledge, the scientific knowledge from the academia, make it into more digestible pieces for our end users, which are always the parents, and also we have some professionals, language teachers, and SLPs.
Yeah. And Eduarda Ribeiro also saying thank you, obrigada. Thank you to you for following us. Yes, as you said, what we hope that everyone gets out of this, maybe we can have some final tips or some final words to close this session. Ulrike, what kind of tips or suggestions would you have for parents at this point? We can also put them together, all three of us. It's not necessary.
Yeah, I think children, when you say parents have, as I think we mentioned it already, have to be aware of the complexity, not just its context, its complexity in the family. We have evidence that, you know, you might be very happy, you know, using your heritage language with the first child. It won't work the same way with the second because the conditions have changed. There is so much to know about that and the dynamics and the changes in development. And it's not always easy. Yeah, I can understand that. I mean, I for myself, I started teaching my children English, and but then, you know, that in kindergarten, all of that was kind of destroyed. Maybe I didn't put too much effort into that because, you know, they didn't want to do that any longer because they had the feeling, why should we do that? Because then they would be different from the others, or, you know, whenever I tried to work with English, they didn't. So I tried other things to make them, you know, to get them into contact with other cultures, etc. But it could. I have many examples where it works out, but it's not always easy. So I have people around me that have been working with me for a long time, who raise their children bilingually, multilingually, but it's a lot of effort that has to be put into the process.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I've just shared also the reference to your article from 2022 with Dolas and Seddon or Chedden
Yeah.
about the cognitive advantages of multilingual learning on metalinguistic awareness.
Okay.
In the Journal of Cognition, yes.
We continue to have comments, thanks from our readers, our listeners, watchers.
And it's nice to see them.
Absolutely.
Ricky, Mikey.
And I'd like to put up from Ricky, who says, totally agree. There are so many factors that influence young multilingual minds. And that I think really captures the essence of what Ulrike was talking about today. It's all very complex. It's not just the methods that are, you know, there's various, you know, ideas and information that you need to learn and know about, but it's also your kids. That's also very variable. I have 4 kids, and all 4 of them are different. You need to tailor your strategy accordingly. There's just no one size fits all. I mean, as much as people hate the answer, it depends. Lots of things, it just depends. So the more, you know, what we want to do is provide as much information for our end users as possible, and you can take that information. All knowledge are good as tools that you can sort of build up and create your castle with the tools, the hammers and the things that we provide. So hopefully it's useful for all our audience, and we will continue to do so every month on the 3rd Tuesday of the month at this time. Normally, you will find us on this channel. Any last words, Ute?
No. Not you made it nicely, so I have nothing to add. Otherwise,
well, in that case, I will continue. No.
Yes, no, you can always continue. No, I would like to quote quickly also Yoshito. He's one of our followers, right, and friends. Thank you very much. Very interesting insights, and he also works with 4 multilingual families and provides a lot of very useful and important input for those families who want to foster pluri or multiliteracy in their children. So that's another aspect, but that we might cover in another session as well.
Multilingual Dad on Instagram. Find him. He's a tremendous resource, especially about literacy. So he's got books out there. So definitely find Multilingual Dad, multilingual_dad on IG. And talk to him. He's very friendly, very approachable, and very, very knowledgeable. Yes. All right. And
perfect.
What else do we have?
That shows that multilingual education is worthwhile pursuing. But there's a lot of knowledge out there to be passed on to future teachers. But that's, you know, a political issue that we haven't been able to proceed the way we want to do that. I've been trying to do that. The last chapter of the DMM is devoted to multilingual education.
Mm-hmm.
So when people talk about translanguaging nowadays, I started doing that a long time ago. So we need holistic approaches to multilingual education. There's a lot to be done, and it makes a lot of sense because we've got evidence from research that we can train multilingual awareness as the core factor of multilingual learning.
Yes. And again, if it comes from school and it comes also from home, then you can bridge it, and then you can build actually something. And I would like to quote, as we are talking about building, and I like this from Ricky Mugi, we'll keep building our castles. Let's keep building the multilingual castles. Thank you, Ricky, for this hint. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And thank you everyone for following us today. If you are watching the recording, please leave some comments under the video on YouTube or on Facebook, and we are going to get back to you.
Fantastic. One last thank you to Dr. Jessner. Thank you so much for sharing your time. It's precious for everybody. So very honored to have you on. And to everybody else, well, we'll see you in 1 month on the 3rd Friday in May. Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bis zum nächsten Mal. Arrivederci, alla prossima.
Sayonara.